All right, good morning. We're here to go through a presentation on how to read an Equifax credit report, specifically formatted within Keystone Correlation. And I will screen share and we'll get started. So this will be a follow-up. If you're watching this, hopefully you've been through segments 1 and 2, which go through an overview of the credit ecosystem, some of the rules and regulations that govern consumer credit reports, and then in addition, some Equifax specific consumer database topics, including how long information stays in a credit report. Um, those are both sections that were previously recorded. And so to get started, the first thing we're going to talk about is within a consumer credit report for Equifax, what is included and what is not included. Uh, First and foremost, what we call PII or personal identifiable information. This is obviously your name, address, social security number, date of birth, phone number, and then employment history as available. We say as available. The credit report actually has a employment section, but it is updated either at the consumer request or if it's furnished to Equifax. It's not a common field in 2025. 20 plus years ago, it was pretty common for consumers or employers to report employment information, but that's not something that's not as relevant today. So you may see employment information, doesn't mean it's necessarily accurate. And then, of course, the report's going to contain primarily the credit history for the consumer or the member, all their account details, such as when accounts were opened, what were their credit limits, what was the original loan amount, what's the current balance or the balance last reported, what are the payment terms, how many months was the loan, what's their scheduled monthly payment, and then, of course, all the history since the loan was opened. You're going to see inquiries. These are going to be hard inquiries made by other creditors because those stay on the report for up to 2 years. And that's just going to show you other institutions, lenders that have viewed that consumer's credit report, whether or always as a result of that consumer or member applying for a loan. And then, of course, we're going to share with you public records and collections. Public records primarily today in 2025 being bankruptcies. Previously, we had public records like tax liens and judgments, but those came off of the credit report as a result of a regulatory action a number of years ago. And in terms of what's not in a credit report, or what we say what's out of a credit report, any checking or savings account data that the member or consumer may have. And when we say checking or savings data, this is like individual balances, current information. There are provisions where if a member or consumer has had a charged off checking account where they overdrawn and did not pay the institution back, they can report that information as a collection item. But in terms of just active checking account or savings account data, that's not going to be included. Any information on bankruptcies that's more than 10 years old. You may remember from a previous section of training, most bankruptcies will stay on the credit report 10 years from the date filed, with the exception of a Chapter 13 that's been discharged. Those will come off 7 years from the date filed. So any bankruptcy history that's more than 10 years old is not going to be on the credit report. Again, any judgments and liens, talked briefly about that. Any charged off debts or collection items more than 7 years old, as you may remember from a previous segment, any derogatory or delinquency really period typically has that 7 year timer from the time it occurs to when it falls off the report. Again, with the exception of most bankruptcies. Generally speaking, any charged off collection or other delinquencies are going to fall off after 7 years from the date of occurrence. Any demographic information such as gender, ethnicity, religion, political affiliation, none of that's being captured. None of that's included in a consumer report or a credit report. There's no medical history, no criminal records, no motor vehicle records, and then certainly we don't give any kind of details on actual items purchased by a credit card. You just see the individual card type. So whether it's a retail card, whether it's or a bank issued bank card, as we call them, like an Amex, a Visa, MasterCard. And then our reports are broken into sections. So we always start with what we call header information. And the first thing that happens on our side when you pull a credit report is we're going to do a quick comparison on the information that you submitted to Equifax when you take an application from a new member or a prospective member or existing member. When you take that application and they give you their information, the first thing we're going to do is give you back some insights into what do we see on file for this consumer, this individual. And so, obviously, in addition to their name, one of the first things we're going to provide are fraud alerts. And so, has this individual been a victim of fraud? Do they think they may be a victim? Or have they potentially placed an active duty military alert on their file? The difference is for an initial fraud victim, you do not have to be a victim of fraud for these. These can occur when individuals sign up for credit monitoring services like a LifeLock or other companies out there that just for some added protection, they may want to place an initial fraud victim on their file. If they lose a wallet, they may have just misplaced it. It doesn't necessarily mean somebody's found it or is perpetrating fraud. It may just be that they think they could be a victim. Does not require any kind of police report. They can contact one of the bureaus. We will notify the other two, and those will stay on the file for up to 1 year. An extended fraud victim alert. These do mean the individual has been a victim of fraud. They do require a police report, and they stay on the file for up to 7 years. At any time, I believe consumers can remove these fraud alerts if for whatever reason they would want to. It would not be common to do so, but they would stay on for 7 years for an extended fraud victim. Active duty military, this is separate from the Military Lending Act, which is a separate uh, reg that the credit union would have to follow in order to determine if an individual is a covered borrower. An active duty military flag is something they can post if they are on active duty. They can notify the bureau, and those will stay on for 12 months. That typically means they've been deployed overseas. And so that's important. If you'll see a lot of instances where uh, a husband or wife may be deployed overseas, and then the other spouse will come in and need to apply for credit while they're overseas, just to make you aware and deal with that accordingly. You'll notice a number, and we will go through a lot of these sections as we go through this. Again, there's a lot of information within the header that we will cover, such as, we're obviously going to give you back the name, the age of the individual potentially. You'll notice some blanks. A blank doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem. It just may mean that there's information that either Equifax does not populate, because it's not when Keystone creates the credit report format, they do so, it's bureau agnostic. And so they may have clients that are pulling another bureau that's not Equifax that may have fields that are populated that they have that Equifax does not, or vice versa. Um, or it may be a legacy field, something that was used in the past that's not necessarily used today. So generally speaking, when you're getting the information is what does Equifax have on file for that individual at that point in time. When we talk about identity scans, this identity scan product that we have, this is an additional look when you have an application or when you input the information for that individual, so consumer name, if that were the potential member, we're going to bump up the information, so the PII, the name, address, social, date of birth, up against other databases outside of the credit report to look for potential red flags. And so we're going to give you those alerts here. Indications doesn't necessarily mean that it may be fraud, it's just a red flag. So has the social been reported as deceased? Has there been suspected fraud at the address? Has the address ever been reported as misused, or is the address non-residential? Sometimes consumers, members will come in and give you a campground address. They may, and which may be legitimate. They may be living at a campground. They may give you an apartment, not an apartment, an actual hotel address. And so it's just important to know we will give you those alerts. Um, in the identity scan section. And a full listing of those alerts is available that we can provide if needed. One of the items you'll notice that's important is what we call a do not combine indicator and an address discrepancy indicator. Address discrepancy indicator is a newer, uh, I say newer, within the last 10 to 20 years now, still new, relatively speaking, in credit terms, of when we give you an alert, and one thing that we search is the address that Equifax has on file materially different than the one you provided on your application? Doesn't mean that the address that you were given is not legitimate, but it could certainly warrant a further investigation if you were given an address that does not match an address that Equifax has on the credit report as the current address. And you will see a yes in that field. There is a do not combine indicator, which is less common to see, but possible and something to look for. That is when a consumer has contacted Equifax and has indicated that there may be multiple files. Again, this may be siblings. It could be a father, son, like a junior, senior, where they live at the same address for a period of time. It could be individuals with similar names, family with similar names. There may be a variety of reasons that an individual may have a credit report that has been inadvertently combined just based on the dynamics of how the databases are managed. And if they put a do not combine um, indicator on there, it could be an indicator that that person may have previously been a fraud victim. It's something worth looking into, or potentially, especially depending on the other information that you see in the report. And so if you we'll go into some other details on like factors like date of last activity and file created dates and things like that to give you an idea of putting together the picture of, do I think I'm looking at the correct full report for the individual that I'm working with? Then we get into the broader, just what we call the identification section of the report, which is again starting to look deeper into what information does Equifax have on file for this individual. And so obviously we've already.
Hey Matt, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I'm having issues hearing you right now.
Oh, no.
I think it's me, but hold on.
Okay.
I think it's my audio, but I'm trying to fix it as best I can.
Okay, that's fine. Hopefully it's hopefully it's coming through clear. And if we watch the recording and it's not clear, we can re-record. Um, is that any better? Is that any better? Looks like everything's okay on my side. And I hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, and I can hear you now. I don't
Awesome.
know what happened. It just
That's
all
okay.
sound went out.
That's okay. Nice little pause.
Okay.
So, so we're talking about the identification section of the report, and so this again is starting to give more expansive information into what information does Equifax have on file for this individual versus, or just what information does Equifax have on file for this individual in terms of addresses, prior addresses, um, any other um, relevant information to your application. And so primarily you're going to see again the name that we have, the file since date. This is important. This is the date that this credit report was created. You'll notice it right here, file since date, September 30th, 2015. This is the date this particular credit file was created within the Equifax database. Many consumers, that correlates to the first time they start applying or become credit active at the age of 18. So for general, as a general rule, um, consumers start becoming credit active anywhere in those 18 to early 20s. Maybe it's into their mid 20s. And so you can generally map back based on date of birth as as a consumer becomes again into the 18 plus, into the credit active range, you would expect their credit report to be created around that same time frame. If you're working with an individual that say is 40 years old or 50 years old, and their file since date is pretty recent, so in other words they may not be credit active until they're much older, that could be a good indicator of a possible problem with their file within the system, meaning they may have had history in the past that may have been linked to another credit report. It may be that the reports you pulled for some reason was not the correct report. We have ways to help you investigate and determine, is that a potentially fraudulent report? Some consumers will try to scrub information off their file. They will try to intentionally trick the system to create reports. So it's always a good indicator to look at that file since date and then piece together based on the individual's age, to determine if you may be looking at a report that's not a complete picture. Most consumers will just have one report, and for the vast majority of the time, you will just get the correct report, and it'll have the again the file since date that should be around that, sometime between their 18th birthday and into their 20s, which is most common. uh, you'll see the date of last activity. That is the date that is the last time information was reported to Equifax on this individual. And that can be on anything within the report. It can be an inquiry, it could be a trade line update, it could be any information we get, just to give you a sense of recency, the last time that we got information for that individual. Again, if that's a date that's older, that may be something that is, it could be unusual, maybe worth looking into. Um, that's something that you would potentially look at. Hit codes, these are going to be things like if for some reason if we may provide limited information if a consumer's requested a freeze on their credit report, you may get back a limited amount of information and then a hit code indicating that this credit file is frozen, which simply means you're not legally not allowed to obtain until that consumer unfreezes their file, and they can reach out directly to Equifax to do so, or if they've locked their file through an app. If there's a no hit, that simply means we did not, using the information that was provided, we did not find a credit report in our database that matched that information.
So that's gonna be like a new, someone new to credit, correct?
Typically, yes, typically so.
With this hit code right here, because we have a hit code with the one in parentheses, does the one have any pertinence to what we're looking for? Like if it's a one versus a two or a three, or we'll see
But
that.
there's a list, they'll have a number, but a hit typically means we match to the file that you were looking for.
Okay.
And in a previous section of training, we went through a pretty good, and there was information covered in pretty good depth on our match logic. But when you get a hit, that means we have a high confidence that we gave you back the report on the individual that you were looking for. And
Okay.
most of the reports you get are going to be a hit. Yeah, it's either most are going to be a hit, no hit, or a freeze.
Okay.
We're going to report up to 3 addresses on the file, along with the dates that each of those were reported to us. There's within our logic, if you can call it that, there is a process for determining what we believe is the consumer's current address versus a previous address. When we say former, it may not necessarily be former. It may be a combination of if an individual has multiple accounts opened with multiple creditors and 2 or 3 have one address and another 2 or 3 have a separate address, the system has to make, we know it's not likely that they're living at both. But it may be just the way they're presented. One may show as current, one may show as former. Uh, it's obviously worth asking if, depending on your documentation, you'll be able to see if they gave you on the application, if it shows as a former address, it may be worth clarifying, is this actually your current address or is it a former address? Um, with date of birth, this is a field that is furnished to Equifax. We don't validate this. It is something that when I say furnished, excuse me, it is provided to Equifax. It could be blank in some cases. We've seen examples where we do not have a date of birth for an individual, so therefore that information right here may be blank. Um, and sometimes creditors, you'll notice on some files, you may see an age instead because some creditors, when they may furnish the age instead of a birth date. There's no requirement that they do either. We ask for birth date when information is reported to us. So most of the time, you should see a date of birth. A link indicator, you'll notice right underneath hit code is link indicator. Equifax we own uh, a credit database, a consumer credit database for Canadian residents. It's a separate database entirely, but because it's an Equifax owned product and we have integration between that database and this database, if you have an individual who has relocated to AmFirst, of their field of membership market and is applying, and they are a former Canadian resident, you may get a link indicator indicating that the information you're seeing is coming from Canadian furnishers. It's a sister database, if you will. There are 2 fields that Keystone puts uh, into the address. So there's a rent owned by flag, and then there is also a urbanization. Neither of those are standard data points that we're not sure at this time of recording. The rent owned by over here, and then there's an urbanization indicator. These are not uh, data points that we typically capture, so most of the time those are going to be blank. We're generally just going to provide you with the addresses, the first date we obtained the address, the date that address was last reported, and then obviously what that address is. Oops. Yeah. Okay.
Before we move on from that, I do have a few questions just to clarify. Um, our identity scan section. So if a statement is present, like that fraud alert, either it's an initial, extended, or active duty. If there is a fraud statement present on the credit report, is there going to be any indication in the identity scan section?
You will get an initial alert for the fraud victims, you will get an initial code. I have not seen a
Okay.
sample within the fraud victim indicator. And then later in the report, it will give you the specifics of what especially if it's an extended fraud victim, you will get the information. The consumer will provide contact information that they want you to contact that information
Correct.
before you open the account. So that will come later in the report.
Okay, so there's nothing in this top header unless that fraud victim indicator is
Correct.
functioning.
You will first look for the fraud victim indicator, and then towards the end of the report, that's when they're going to give you the specifics, I believe is how Keystone has it.
Perfect. And then again, the identity scan has nothing necessarily to do with an address discrepancy. The address discrepancy indicator is going to be on the third column towards the bottom, and it's just going to be a yes or a no.
Correct.
Okay.
The address discrepancy is specifically telling you that the main address that Equifax has on file for this individual is substantially different than the address that was on your application.
Right.
The
So the identity scan is going to be more of something, hey, there might be something wrong on our back end that might be picking something up.
The identity scan is that there's information related to either their name, social address, date of birth that we think could be potential fraud, that it's a red flag that we would encourage you to look into further. So
Okay.
their address may be a commercial address, a business address. They've given
Okay.
you the, go ahead.
But it's not going to actually say, hey, this address doesn't match anything. It says something with their address may be a potential red flag, like you were saying, a commercial address.
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
You will get the alert and then the specifics of what the alert is. So
Okay.
yeah, this address matches a hotel address, or this address matches a campground address. And so you may
So it's
see an address discrepancy of yes with an identity scan that the address they gave you is a hotel,
okay.
which
Is it ever possible for us to have an address discrepancy as yes, and our identity scan did not detect any alerts?
very common, very common.
Okay.
If somebody recently relocates, it may be that they're in a transition period where their creditors are still reporting them at the old address. They come in and the first thing they do when they move to Birmingham or wherever is they they get their utilities connected, and then they come in and they want to apply for a new membership. And so it may
Right.
be that their credit card and their where they're paying their loans hasn't updated yet. So it may be that they're interacting with you before the system is caught up and that new address is being reported. So address discrepancy doesn't mean it's fraud. It's just again one of those alerts that you would want to look into to verify.
Perfect. Um, because that is one thing that we do look for. And I just want to make sure that we're not missing it because the identity scan said we're good to go, but the address discrepancy said yes. So we
Right.
need to be looking at both.
Look at both.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a combination of looking at the file since date. If you're trying to piece together a picture of this individual and quickly validate that everything they're telling you uh, makes sense or is logical, then yes, you're looking for, are we seeing an address discrepancy? Do we see I'm working with an individual who's 45 years old, but their file since date was 3 years ago. That would be unusual. So yes, it's just a matter of looking at all the different elements and making sure it's telling you the picture that matches what they're telling you.
Perfect.
Okay. Then we're going to start sharing some credit score information on the report. So this is at present, at time of recording, the credit union uses what we call it's called the FICO Score 8, which because of programming, rebranding with FICO scores across the bureaus that happened a number of years ago, it still represents as FACTA Beacon 09. Um, if should the credit union change scores over time, you will see the specific score being returned in this section. So as that changes, what the reports if you view this 6 months from now or a year from now, it may no longer be the FICO score 9. Or the Beacon 09 score. It may be Equifax FICO score 10T or Vantage score 4.0 or another model. But we will specifically tell you the name of the score that you're looking at um, on every report. And then we will give you the corresponding, obviously, in addition to the score, we'll give you the corresponding score reason codes. These are the top reasons why that score is what it is. The reason codes are only intended to tell you the reasons why the score is not higher. They're not meant to be interpreted as a negative potentially, where if you see proportion of loan balances to loan amounts is too high, the individual may have very low balances, but the score is telling you their score may be higher if those balances were lower by some measure. And that's just telling you that that's the number one reason why their score is what it is. You'll see scores for, again, they may be referred to as a score name or a model name. They're one and the same. We're always going to give you back the score number, the name of the score, and then we're going to tell you what the score range is. So the low end of the score is 300 to 850. And then there's a risk-based pricing percentage. which 00074 is indicating to you that this consumer score is higher than 74% of the population. It's important to note when you look, excuse me, important to note when you look at the name of the score, this is very important because credit scores, I use the example of someone can tell you they have an iPhone, but you don't know. It could be anywhere from an iPhone 11 to an iPhone 16. It could be a Pro Max. It could be a Pro. It could be some of the special series that they've made. Even though somebody says they have an iPhone, there may be one of 40 different iPhones out there that they could technically have from a model. FICO, just with FICO alone, they have over, again, at time of recording, 20 plus models that they support, depending on where the person's applying, if they're applying for a car loan versus a mortgage loan versus a credit card, what lender, what bureau. So this is just giving you specifics. You know, you're looking at an Equifax report at a Beacon 09, which correlates to a FICO 8 score. If they ever say they have a score, if they tell you what their score is, again, it can be very different because of the type of score, the bureau, the time it was pulled, etc. Then we go into the report summary, very simple summary within Keystone. We are simply going to give you a summary of how many open trade lines do we see for this person and how many closed trade lines do we see, broken out by account type. So for this sample, we see there's one credit card open, there's one conventional real estate mortgage loan, and there's 7 education loans or student loans open. And for closed trade lines, you can see that there's 1 real estate and then 5 closed student loans. So very, very simple summary of open and closed trade lines that you'll get within the summary. Then the report will go into any public records. If there's no public records, the section will just be blank. Again, if there's a public record, that's going to correlate to a bankruptcy. And we're going to give you information that was reported to Equifax on that bankruptcy filing. The primary pieces of information that we cover, you'll notice there's several fields in the report that aren't necessarily commonly furnished fields or fields that are commonly reported to us by courthouses. The information that we typically get on a bankruptcy is going to be the date filed, the courthouse customer number, and this is a unique, there's a way within the system to identify which particular courthouse this maps to, this unique 10-digit code. The case number, the disposition date reported, is it an individual or joint bankruptcy? They're most always going to be personal bankruptcies, and then of course the disposition and chapter. So is it a dismissed chapter 13, a discharged chapter 13? You're typically going to see chapter 13s or chapter 7s. Then we go into collections. If the individual has collection trades, this is where you will see details on those specific collection items. If there are no collections on the report, then obviously you don't get this information. There's nothing to report. And on the collections, again, there's a lot of fields that furnishers are able to populate. And if they choose to report, it's not required that they choose to report, or it may not be relevant to report all of these fields with a collection. But down here you'll notice the primary elements that we're looking for whenever collections are reported. What was the date reported to Equifax? Who's the original creditor that the balance was owed? And then you'll notice the collection agency name, the actual collection agency that reported the information. What's the current amount? What was the amount? I'm sorry. What was the amount of the collection? And then what is the current balance of the collection? So you'll notice over time, if people are paying it off, not all at once, the original amount may differ from the current balance. And consequently, is the account still open, or is it paid or unpaid? So if they've paid in full, it will be reflected as such. You'll notice a 0 balance, and you can then know that and you'll see a reference that it's a paid account or paid collection. the length of the last active. This is the last time, the last active column. This would be the last time the individual had any interaction on that account with either the credit or the collection agency. The date of first delinquency is when they first chose to consider the consumer delinquent. And the 7-year clock, when we talk about most delinquencies
Mhm.
previously fall off after 7 years, the 7-year clock typically starts at the date of first delinquency.
How we're going over each of these oh, this is where our trade line information, how we're going over each of these sections. Is it how it views on the credit report? So we're going to have our open trade lines, summary, bankruptcies, collections, and then the in-depth trade lines.
Mhm. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, you'll see in-depth trade. The extent to which you use this, I think in this capacity, you're not going into a lot of depth on the trade lines like lending might. But just to give you an idea of how the information is reported, you'll notice when somebody then gets into their specific trade lines, you remember from the summary, the individual had one open mortgage trade. Now we get into the trade lines and you get to the specifics of what that mortgage trade consists of. So who is the lender? What's the balance? Is the account paid as agreed? Does it have any past dues? When was the date of the last payment? You'll notice all of these fields are there, uh, far more descriptive than they would have been in years past, to give you an idea of just details on that mortgage loan. When was the mortgage loan opened? Um, and then you'll notice on mortgages in particular, there's a lot of fields that may not be relevant to that specific um, mortgage type. Is there anything, Robin, you think I should cover on trade lines? Is that
I think just the basis of it would be okay.
Yeah, narrative codes are important to look at. Sometimes you'll notice narrative codes that may be, uh, there's a lot of different narrative codes that you can see. There's a lot of, and this is all documented here, but if somebody is, again, a furnisher may report that an account's included in bankruptcy. You may not have seen a bankruptcy public record filed, but there may be, if you notice a bankruptcy mark on an account, maybe there's something going on there with that individual that hasn't been fully reported yet. So in other words, you may not see a formal bankruptcy notification, but you may see an account in bankruptcy that can come up. But these are all just different examples of portfolio types. Is it a line of credit? Is it an installment loan? Is it a mortgage? An open account? Open accounts are rare in 2025. Revolving, so is it a credit card type account? These are just some example narratives and status types that you will see on those different trade lines. And then, of course, is it paid and closed, refinanced, transferred, sold, or lost or stolen? These are just some other designators that we can provide on ECOA. So authorized user, is there, is the trade line, is the responsibility shared on behalf of another person? Is it a co-maker? And then, of course, we've got all kinds of different creditor classifications that can come back. Just to give you an idea, if it's a trade line type that is not as not commonly named or understood, it can give you an idea into what kind of business that is. We give information on how to read a 24-month payment history. So if an individual has had delinquency, or if they've had any problems over the last 2 years, we will tell you the specific month and severity that delinquency occurred. Most of the time on payment history, you're going to see a series of ones. That simply means for the last 2 years, they paid that account as agreed and the account's been current. If you were to see 6 months back, it starts as the most recent month on the far left, and then 24 months ago is on the far right. So if 6 months ago, if there were a two, that would simply tell you that 6 months ago, that individual account had been 30 or 50, between 30 to 59 days past due. And then, of course, if it goes back to one, that means they went past due and they caught up.
Perfect.
This again is just another view of the ECOA indicators. So if it's an individual account, is it a joint? All of these have different legal distinctions. The 3 or 4 that you will primarily see are going to be individual, joint, authorized user, and then you'll see a fair amount of shared accounts. But for the most part, it's individual, joint, or authorized user. We like to provide some insights into industry codes. So within Equifax, any furnisher or any company, business, lender, credit union, bank, any company that interacts or furnishes data to the Equifax credit database has their own 10-digit unique code. Each of these 10-digit codes, within the middle of those codes, will display an industry affiliation. There's a listing of these industry affiliations to, again, give you an idea of the type of business that this is if it's not clear. Sometimes businesses will use, as an example, the Home Depot, they will report as THD. And so it may not be, if you're not accustomed to looking at it, it may not be exactly clear what that is. But next to the name, you will see, or within the account number, you will see what that industry code is. And then you would at least be able to go to the list and be able to tell that that's a retailer.
Okay.
And if it's helpful to give an example, you can go back to Round Point Mortgage. Their code is FM. It's easy because it has mortgage in the name. But you'll notice their customer number has the letters FM. If I then look at the list, we'll notice FM is a mortgage company.
Oh, okay.
Shocking there because mortgage is in the name, but that's not always the case.
Yeah.
And then just a little bit on inquiries. We're nearing the end. A little bit on inquiries. Only hard inquiries where this individual that you're looking at has applied for credit are going to display. Any soft inquiries you may remember from a previous training segment, they're not going to display and do not affect scores. These are only going to be inquiries that are made within the last 2 years. These are all going to be consumer initiated or member initiated. And we're going to give you the information on when the inquiry occurred, what was the date of the inquiry, and then who was the company. Again, you go back, you'll have the industry code, so you'd be able to tell who that company is. But we're just going to give you the basics on where they were applying for credit. Some of the last pieces of information that we're going to give you, this goes back to the relevancy of some of the other questions we were talking about early on, where we are going to do some additional comparisons for you. And this is in the sections that you're going to start seeing additional information around fraud alerts. But specifically to the identification social, we're going to run a slightly deeper query into that social. So we're going to show you the actual social that's within MDB as the master database for Equifax. What social do we have on file? It's not populated on this example, but does that match what you put in? We have flags to tell you if the social that you input is different than the one we have and which numbers may be off. The date the social that we show that it was issued, the inquiry subject SSN, that's again the social that you put in on the application. Is it confirmed? And then, of course, the byte to byte match goes back to, we're actually going to tell you the specific, is it a 9-to-9 match versus what you put in the system versus what Equifax has on file.
So, just a clarifying point right here. So, inquiry subject SSN is what we have put into the application
Correct.
for the credit pull, and
Yes.
then the MDB subject SSN is that, and that's what you're pulling back.
What Equifax has. And then the byte to byte match tells you, is it a perfect match? Just a
Okay,
just a quick summary, is it a perfect match to what we have versus what you gave us?
perfect. So, but if these two don't match, that's going to be an N.
Correct.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's available today at time of recording. We have the ability to do a 9-for-9 match where we can tell you through 9 wise, and then you can quickly identify if there's an N, which character was either not correct or differs between what you put in versus what Equifax has on file.
Okay.
I don't believe that's available within Keystone today, but it may be available over time.
Yeah, I don't think it's available
And
as of right now.
yeah, that's an enhancement that that they would have to code to be able to
Hmm.
make. OFAC alert, of course, we're running against OFAC. We provide you if there's an OFAC hit and give you that information, and then you're able to then take that and proceed as you would need to. if you got an OFAC hit. But this is, for the majority of cons, it's just a documentation that you actually ran it against the OFAC database and they passed.
Okay.
If there
If we
were,
come up, go ahead.
nope, nope,
If there was a match, what would that kind of look like? So if there was some kind of OFAC hit,
you're going to
what would
get,
the verbiage be?
it's going to be populated. And I can look into the values and try to send those to you so you have them for documentation. Um,
Okay.
but each of these values will just be populated with the relevant. So when was that reported? What was the, who's the name that matched? What was their address, country
Okay.
code, and all of these problem codes map to a long list of what the specific, and I'm not sure how
Okay.
Keystone has coded to display that information.
Okay.
Typically,
So
this
if there,
with compliance referral
perfect.
when there's an OFAC hit
Perfect.
to dig into it further. Yep.
So there's going to be more information here. So if there is an OFAC hit, we'll be aware.
You will get more information, and then that would become, again, within the system, it's going to flag it differently, as I understand, and then you would then refer that internally as
Perfect.
necessary to handle.
Yeah. Great.
I believe that's the end of the report. Um, But if, as I understand, if there were detailed fraud alerts, those generally show up in the same area of the report as these two elements here. So if they were an extended fraud victim and the individual were to have supplied Equifax with extensive contact information, phone numbers, address, they want
Hmm.
you to contact that phone number, then that information is going to show up in this area of the report.
Is it going to be its own header? Like it will have like statement and remarks or
Generally,
something?
it is. Generally, it is.
Okay.
Generally, say fraud alert or fraud, alerts, and it'll either say alerts or fraud alerts, and then it'll give you
Okay.
that expansive information. We weren't given the um, documentation from Keystone on how they address that, but we know they address it.
Right. Okay. But it'll in general be underneath the social security and OFAC headers. So it's
Correct.
after the trade lines,
Understanding.
after a personal. Perfect.
That's my
Okay.
understanding. It's in that section of the report.
Awesome.
So, and that's it. Thank you very much. I will stop
Yeah.
recording. Uh, well,